Okay, so today's topic is biomedical research, which a lot of you will do. In fact, probably all of you will do, although in different types of environments. So what I want to give you is an overview today of the different environments in which research is done and some of the opportunities you'll have in those settings. So there are a lot of different environments for research. There's academics. So those of you who are here in grad school are presumably doing most of your work in research in an academic environment. Some of you work, for example, in the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine. We're doing work that I guess you could characterize as academic because we're getting these grants that are being given to a university. Now sometimes colleges will do research, and by colleges I mean those undergraduate institutions. So a couple of you were, or at least Sarah was with me couple weeks ago when we went out to Amherst, and so that's an undergraduate college where they're actually doing some research. They have research funds, and so the students there do it with their faculty. There's other research environments that are common. So in the government is always doing research. Both the federal government, the United States government, as well as the different state governments, and of course worldwide. These would be national or local governments that are doing research. Looking at problems like what's the water quality, what's the air like, what effect does the tobacco legislation have on various, putting a tax, for example, on cigarettes, what effect might that have on cutting smoking? And then there's other research environments which are outside of academics and government, which are more in terms of what private industry does. So a big one is the pharmaceutical industry, people making drugs, making money from making drugs. So that has an effect on the environment that they do things in and also how they do the research. Biotech, all of the gene genetics revolutions and all the different biomarkers that we now make and the devices we use and the products, those are all done using a lot of research. And then finally, there's the contract research organization, which is basically the group that oftentimes does the analysis and the design for the companies that want to do the research. So for example, a company may have a lot of chemists who come up with a new product. They now need to test that product out in order to get regulatory approval to sell it. They may not have in-house expertise into how to set up the study and how to do the analysis. They may contract it out to a research organization which does this kind of thing, which has that kind of expertise. And so they hire them as consultants, just like a subcontractor would be hired to build a building. Now, some of the projects are going to be initiated by investigators. So these I'm thinking of as more in the academic realm. You are a graduate student, or you are a faculty member, or some other kind of relationship you have where you might be doing your thesis, or you might be doing a dissertation, or you might be collaborating with colleagues. So for example, you have a friend who's in the economics department who needs you to help them do some kind of analysis. There are little research ideas that come up all the time where you're kind of working on something and you say, I wonder if we did a little simulation study, how would those procedures work in those situations? Or you're doing an applied project where you're doing a study. So for example, the study that we're doing on N of 1, we're looking at developing a mobile app device to do N of 1 studies, which are single patient clinical trials. And so there's some interesting little problems that we can work off of that, depending on which models we use. How well do those models work? How do we simulate those models? And what are the properties of the different models that we might use, and in what situations do they work? So these are all investigator-initiated projects that typically you might or might not go to get funding for. You might just do in your spare time because you need to get a paper because you want to advance your resume or your career. Or you're just interested in doing the project. Some of these can also be done as a way of doing preliminary work to be getting a new grant proposal. So it's very hard to get grant money. and usually you have to prove not only that you're capable of doing it, but that the preliminary work you've done supports the idea. They don't like to just give money for ideas that are completely out of the blue. So the money would be given to do this in such a way that it would depend on what you've done in the past. And so these little projects might be preliminary work you're doing as part of a way to get further funding. Now, most of us in academia, at least, and even some people in private industry, look to the government for support for the research. So most of the research that we do is supported by a grant. A grant can be either coming from the government or could be coming from a private foundation or from a company. The biggest payers in government are the National Science Foundation, the NSF, and the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. If you look at the federal budget every year, the NIH gets about $30 billion, and the NSF gets about $7 billion. And these numbers might be a little bit different now, but they're in the rough ballpark. NIH supports all biomedical research. NSF basically supports everything else. So one could argue that the NSF should actually have more money. However, you have to remember that healthcare is 1/6 of the economy in the country, so there's a lot more money riding on healthcare. And also people are very concerned about their health. Well, it's important to know when the solar system began, or it's important to know what a certain climate effect would have on a certain animal. These are all really important scientific problems. People are much more interested in can we find a way to cure cancer, or can we find a way to reduce the effect of diabetes, or what do we do about our parents who have Alzheimer's? So these kinds of problems, because they're so much more valued by society in a sense, means that there's more money given to the NIH. Now that's good if you're in biostatistics, because typically that's where we get our money from. There's also other federal agencies that give out money for science. So the Department of Defense, surprisingly enough, does not just spend money on making bombs and airplanes and providing support to soldiers. It also does a lot of medical research. Now, part of that is because soldiers get injured and they want to know how to treat them. Part of it is because soldiers have families and they want to know how to treat those families. They give a lot of money to, for example, to breast cancer research. There's also a lot of development in the science realm that the Department of Defense funds. So there's actually a very interesting little graphic which describes all the different scientific research that went into making the iPad or any tablet. There was research that went into, the LCD displays, into the batteries, into all of the apps that go on the system. All of this stuff was supported by grants from the government, a lot of times to people who weren't even thinking about making an iPad, were doing it for some other purpose. For example, they were trying to figure out how batteries could be longer lived so that soldiers could take them out into the desert where there might not be any kind of electrical outlet. Another agency which does a lot of funding is the Center for Disease Control. That's been in the news a lot lately with Ebola and all the other infectious diseases, but the CDC also is very responsible for making sure that the influenza outbreaks don't overwhelm the country, or that we get the right medicine, the right vaccines for our year-to-year flu vaccines and so forth. Another agency that does a lot of research is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. That funds a lot of my work and my group's work. What they're interested in is how well does the healthcare system work, and how can we better improve the way the healthcare system works. And then finally, the Department of Agriculture actually also puts in a lot of money, because they're interested in controlling pests, for making sure that crops are grown more effectively, that we have better strains of wheat and rice and staple crops that we need to survive on. And then finally, the state departments of public health often give out money. So for example, the state of Rhode Island might be very interested in trying to reduce the rate of AIDS in the state. They might realize that people with AIDS or HIV are not being well enough cared for, and they're trying to figure out better ways of coming up with long-term care solutions for people like this. Now, if you do go for a grant, there's a lot of different mechanisms you can go for, and a lot of them depend on the level that you're at and the collaborators you have. The biggest grants are called R01. NIH has this system where all the grants are labeled by a letter and a number. So the R grants are kind of the investigator-initiated grants. R01 means a large grant, oftentimes several $millions, that carries out a program of research. So for example, I had one a while ago where we were looking at different ways of modernizing meta-analysis. And so we were developing some software, we were developing some methods, and we were also doing some applications. Other people might have R01s to study better ways of treating for patients who have diabetes, or developing new treatments for people with diabetes. R03s are smaller versions of these, usually $100,000, maybe for 2 years rather than for 5 years. They are usually more kind of pilot projects. They're oftentimes given to younger investigators who don't yet have the long set of preliminary work that's often needed to get an R01, but it's a good kind of grant to get your foot in the door. There are also small business grants, the SBIR and the STTR. If you have an idea which you want to commercialize, you can sometimes hook up with a small company, and they get half the money to do the development of the project, and you get half the money to kind of come up with the ideas. So for example, if you're developing a software system, you might get in line with a software company. They do most of the coding and make sure that it's useful to the people who are going to use it, and you're the person developing the algorithms. There's other grants like the R21 and the R33. These are for high-risk projects, things that may have a great payoff but may also completely fail. And so the R21 is kind of the initial phase. The R33 is the follow-on phase. If you meet the initial criteria, you can go on and get some more money. There's R36 grants for dissertations. If you're doing a PhD dissertation and you want to get some money to support yourself, you can apply to certain agencies and get grants for that. There's a K series, K01, K08, K23. Depending on what your background is, these are generally postdoctoral grants, oftentimes given to either medical doctors or PhDs, and they're kind of educational and career awards. What they basically do is they give you protected time. They'll pay, let's say, 75% of your salary from 3 to 5 years, in which case you write a grant which says what's the program of research you want to do and what do you want to learn. So they're a combination of education research grants. You might say, for example, I'd really like to do this particular project, but to do this project I need to learn a lot about qualitative research. So you take a lot of courses in qualitative research, you have mentors who do that, and that's part of the grant. The T32s are training grants. These are oftentimes given to institutions. We have a few here at Brown. We should be getting some more, hopefully. What they do is they are both pre- and postdoctoral grants where you can go onto that grant and be supported while you do your research. And they're training grants, so the idea is they're meant to be for people who are training. And then there's also F grants, which are oftentimes pre-doctoral support as well for people in different situations. So I've put a link up there. You can go to the NIH website, and there's a whole list of what all the different grants are, what all the requirements are. They all have different dates for when they're due. Some of them require letters of intent. They all have a very specific format. You should get to know your administrator of your department very well. The people who submit these things, they're your best friends. They'll help you put together the budgets. They'll help you submit this thing. If you try to do this on your own, it's kind of a nightmare. If you can concentrate on just the scientific part of it and in getting the whole group together, it makes things a lot easier. Now, in addition to public money from the government, there's also private money. And this is going to become increasingly more important because, as you all know, governments don't have unlimited funds. And there are a lot of things that the government wants to spend money on. And at least in the United States, it's very possible that after next Tuesday, I hope everybody knows what next Tuesday or tomorrow, everybody knows what tomorrow is election day. It's widely predicted that as the election is going to change the government quite a bit, and the people who are elected don't want to spend money. They think that we're spending way too much money, and we're in debt, and we should be spending money on other things. And so it's very possible that a lot of these initiatives may be cut back quite a bit, in which case it's going to be even harder to get money, and right now it's incredibly difficult to get grants. So you're going to want to go to these private foundations that also give out money. So the Gates Foundation, founded by Bill and Melinda Gates, they emphasize a lot of different sort of evolving diseases in the third world. They concentrate on AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, but they do lots of other things. And they're open for any sort of interesting ideas. Now, the one thing you got to remember about foundations is oftentimes the trust funds that are set up with these monies specify what they can spend their money on. So they can't necessarily spend their money on anything. They're also looking for good payback, just like the government is, but they really want to get good publicity out of this. So they want you to be dealing with things which have high profile and which are going to, work. Another group that does a lot of research is the Carter Center, founded by former President Jimmy Carter. They've actually done a lot of work in Africa and have managed to almost eliminate diseases like river blindness, guinea worm, trachoma, malaria, schistosomiasis, and they also do some work in mental health. There's other groups like the Rockefeller Foundation, which funds a lot of different types of things, and then there are specific disease-oriented organizations like the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, the Alzheimer's Association, the March of Dimes. These all have specific focuses of what they want to fund. Obviously, the Cancer Society is funding research in cancer. The March of Dimes is looking into childhood disabilities, and there's many others like this. And these are, most institutions will have an office which will help you to sort of look into these kinds of things. So if you have an idea, if you're working in a specific area, these are good organizations to look at. They also have some training funds as well. Okay, so you got government, you got private industry or private foundations, and now you've got private industry. So companies can give grants and contracts as well. We've gotten some contracts from companies who are, for example, interested in developing new methods, or they might be interested in having you work with them on a specific product that they're developing. They may have some methodology issues. They may have some other types of issues that they need your expertise on. Sometimes you're just required, you can be hired as a consultant. Sometimes you're hired, you could get an internship there. Usually the contracts will require non-disclosure, which means that these are proprietary concerns that you're dealing with. These are products they're trying to sell. They don't want their competitors to learn all about them. So there's a contract you signed that basically says, I'm not going to tell somebody else what you're doing. Now, this could be money for training, for consulting, or for experimental research. We're trying to get more relationships here at Brown with companies. For example, I believe CVS is coming in next week. I've been talking with couple other companies. We're going to try to get these people to come in who are looking for either interns or for people to hire when they graduate. These are good opportunities as a student to work with these people, because it gives you a good sense of kind of what kind of problems are out there and what it's like to work in a team environment. But be aware that there can be strings attached. So one of the strings that's often attached that bothers universities no end is the idea of publication. So at universities, the idea is that we have freedom of information, and whatever we discover, we're allowed to publish, whether it's positive or negative. Now think about a company has hired me, let's say, to work on a project, and I do my analysis and I find out that their product is really bad. In fact, it's dangerous. Are they going to let me publish that? They probably don't want me to publish that, because if I publish it, their stock's going to go through the floor and they're going to lose a lot of money. However, if my contract has been set up properly, and the university lawyers will usually try to make sure that this is the case, I should be allowed to publish whatever I do, because I'm doing this as an employee of the university, under contract to this company, but I'm not an employee of that company, right? So this is something that you should be very aware of when you get involved in something. You don't want to do 5 years of work thinking that you're going to come out of this with a wonderful product, and then at the end the company tells you you can't publish it because you didn't find what they wanted you to find. Or they've now moved on to something different and they don't want to do this anymore. So be very careful about that. Another thing that companies will do is they will support things like conferences, fellowships, training, and education. So let's say you want to do a conference on some certain way to do clinical trials, or how we should use causal inference in clinical trials. Some company might be very interested in that because that's something that is a technique that their company can use in their future work. So they might be willing to fund a conference that you set up to do that. All right. Now there may be some strings attached to that. Sometimes what it means is that there's a report that you have to give to the company. You might also be even able to publish the results of that conference. But again, these are things that you can think about as you go along. Likewise with fellowships and training, a lot of times companies are willing to have students come and work there for a while to learn about the company, and hopefully, if you know any friends who are lawyers, this is how they get jobs, right? After law school, usually after their first or second year, they go work in a law firm for the summer, and if the company likes them, they hire them. So it's a good way to get a job as well. Now, the government not only funds you to do research, or people at universities, it also does its own research. So there is what's called intramural research, which means inside the walls. Intramural means inside the walls. And extramural, which means outside the walls, right? So at the NIH, each of the 27 institutes, the heart, lung, and blood, mental health, nursing research, these all have their own researchers who do their own research, as well as funding people from the outside. They employ thousands of scientists. It's another great way to get a job. If you like living in DC, or even some of these areas are outside the DC area, it's a great way to do research there in a nice environment. They have very good benefits. They also monitor extramural grants. So when I go down for a study section, I'm going down to evaluate other people's proposals. If those proposals are good enough and they get funded by the government, then the government gives money to somebody to do the research, but then there's usually what's called a project officer, who's somebody who at the government you work with, who is responsible for making sure that you do what you're supposed to do. And if you have questions, you can ask them questions. So, at the end of your 3-year grant or whatever, you have to write a final report. They want to make sure that final report is actually going to have shown that the money was well spent, because remember that these institutes are getting their money from Congress and ultimately from the taxpayers, and if they're funding grants that are doing worthless things, or they're funding people who are not doing what they're supposed to do, then they look bad and they'll end up losing money. And then they might lose their jobs. So they're very interested in making sure that you do a good job, but they're also very helpful. Now, in pharmaceutical and biotech and healthcare, there are a lot of internal research and development groups as well. So all of the big companies have loads and loads of chemists and geneticists and computer scientists and so forth, who are making sure that all that research is being done, that they're churning through all the different molecules to see, what will turn into the latest blockbuster drug. There are many different types of scientists there. As I say, there could be psychologists, there can be environmental scientists, there can be computer scientists, neuroscientists, and so forth. Their employees are scientists, so they attend conferences and write papers just like you would if you were in a university. In fact, if you go to big conferences, you will find that it's usually made up of people from industry, government, and academia. Now, some people sort of move from one job market to the other. So they go from academia, then they might take a job in industry, they might come back to academia. And I've got several friends who've done that. Why do they do that? Well, typically companies pay better. So if you want more money, you can go to the company. But they put more restrictions on you because you're working on what they want you to work on. You're not as free to work. On the other hand, if you like to be in an environment where you're developing products that are going to make people healthy, then that might be something you want to do. Other people like to work at a university where it's a little more sort of free to do what you want, but then you have teaching responsibilities. So there's trade-offs of these things. Now, when you do go to work for a company, obviously the data that you are working with are oftentimes confidential, right? So the company doesn't want this information out, so you're sworn to secrecy, and there's all kinds of issues. We've talked about the limitations on publication, and a lot of times the marketing department is going to have the final say. So years ago, I worked on a vaccine for Lyme disease with a company. I was originally hired to be on the Data Safety Monitoring Board. They decided that the doctor I was working with, they wanted him to be the PI of the project. They oftentimes do this because when they publish in the high-profile clinical journals, they want an academic to be the face of the paper rather than the company because it looks better. So when he became an author of the paper, I became an author of the paper too. It turned out that the drug actually worked. The vaccine reduced the incidence of Lyme disease by about 50%. There were some signals that there might be some side effects, but they weren't really strong signals because it was a very rare event. The company went on to market the product. Within 2 years, because so many people were using it, because Lyme disease is so prevalent, they were getting lots of reports of people who were having bad reactions to the vaccine. They ended up pulling the vaccine off the market. If they had listened to the person at the beginning who was saying there could be some issues here, they might not have made that mistake. But they decided to go ahead and market the drug because they thought they could make some money. They ended up with a bunch of lawsuits. So whether or not they actually think they succeeded, I think there now is finally another vaccine for Lyme disease that's in development that's coming out fairly soon, but this was a good 15 years. So this kind of thing can happen. So what are some types of companies? Pfizer is one, Merck, Roche, Sanofi. There's tons of pharmaceutical companies out there. CVS, Caremark, they do, they're the guys who have all the drug stores and the minute clinics, and they sell lots of pharmaceuticals. They are doing lots of analysis all the time to figure out whether to sell you more toothpaste or whether a certain type of way they set up their store works better, what types of health products they should be providing you. And then there are companies like Genentech, which are more biotech companies, which are developing molecules that will hopefully solve diseases. Then another group that does research, as I mentioned, is the Contract Research Organization. So examples of these are companies like Westat, Quintiles. What they do basically is a company, let's say Pfizer, has a drug that they've developed, and they want to do a clinical trial. They need to do the clinical trial because the FDA requires it for them to get licensure to sell the drug. They may not have the staff or the capability of doing that big clinical trial, which will cost up to $1 billion. They have to do the recruitment, the monitoring, all the sampling, all the analysis. So they hire a company that does that, and that's what these companies do. If you work for those companies, they have statisticians, they have data monitors, they have all kinds of regulatory staff, people who can help you speed things through the regulatory process. They have writers, monitors. They often oversee the study sites. So if a university is one of the sites where this trial is being run, maybe like a hospital or a doctor's office, they'll have people come in and look at your records and make sure they're being accurately collected. And there's a lot of travel for these people because they're going all over the country to monitor these different types of projects. So if you work in a company like this can be a very exciting thing to do. You can get to travel to all kinds of nice places. You can work on all kinds of different projects, and it's pretty good pay as well. All right, so if you're going to apply for a grant, obviously it's important to do if you want to do research in the life sciences. Some of the research supports wet labs, some supports dry labs, some supports analysis. I'll say more about this in another week or two when we talk more about the grant process, but there are basically two types of costs with grants. There are the direct costs, which are the costs to support the salaries of the people on the grant, together with all the equipment that's needed by the grant. and the travel and so forth. And then there's indirect costs. And what indirect costs are is, think about if you did a grant at Brown, and so let's say my group upstairs does a grant. We get $100,000 to do a grant. So that money pays for me and my colleagues to do the work. It might pay for a couple of computers. Who's going to pay for the lights? Who's going to pay for the person to clean the bathrooms? Who's going to pay for the heating? Who's going to pay for the building upkeep, right? That's got to come from somewhere. So universities set up a system with the government where the government gives them a certain percentage back of all the monies that they get in research. So Brown's indirect cost rate is, I think, 60-something%, which means that for every dollar that I bring in as a researcher, they get an extra 60 cents in indirect costs. So if I get a $100,000 grant, the grant's actually for $160,000 because $60,000 comes back to the university. And this is all negotiated between the universities and the government. This supports all the things like the administrative staff, the secretarial staff, the computer support, all these things which you can't necessarily put on your grant. It's called the infrastructure. It helps the university run. And basically, to do a grant, you need to put in an application. It needs to be reviewed and approved. And that's a very difficult process. Only about 10% of grants that are submitted are actually approved and funded. And then once it's funded, you would be responsible for making some reports. So every year or so you need to return a report, and then your final reports are due at the end of your granting period. Let me just close this because since we're trying to video this, or audio it, I don't know how loud that's going to be. And then finally, the last part of the granting process is the manuscripts, right? So you're going to write a report, but hopefully you'll write some manuscripts and you'll publish them. And if you're an academic researcher, that's obviously important for your career advancement. But it might also be important for your career advancement if you're at a company as well, because a lot of companies look at this too. All right, so what's a grant look like? Just very briefly. The grant has the scientific part. The scientific part of a grant is the specific aims, which is usually one page, which kind of is a rough outline of what you're going to do. It says all the main things you're going to do, plus a little bit of the background and significance for why you're doing it. And then at the end, a paragraph or so which says kind of, if I accomplish all this, what will it do for society? Then there's a section on significance and background, which says, why is this problem important? There's also oftentimes an innovation section which says what's new about it. And then there are the methods which explain what you're going to do and how you're going to do it and how much time it's going to take. And these are very carefully scrutinized by the study sections that are evaluating the grants to make sure that what you're proposing is new and original, it's important, it's valid, and that you can actually accomplish it. So you might, for example, think that you're doing a wonderful study, but it turns out that the people that you're planning to recruit for the study, you're never going to be able to recruit because you've forgotten that, you've forgotten some important thing. For example, let's say that you're doing a nutrition study and you want to have people come in and eat a certain type of diet that's monitored. Well, the people that you're able to recruit to do that will typically be very special types of people. If the study requires you to stay overnight or to stay for a period of time or to come back for a period of time, these would not be necessarily people who have small children who need to be home caring for their children, or people who have busy jobs, or people who live far away from their office. These might be unemployed people or older people or students or people who are looking for some extra cash. So that may not actually be representative of the population. So the study section might say, well, this is a nice idea, but it's not going to fly because what you're going to find is not going to be a valid conclusion. Other parts of the grant that are important are the budget. Obviously, you need to tell them what the money is for and how it's going to be used and support that. Subcontracts, which means you might have colleagues at other institutions who you want to work with, and you've got to pay them as well. Human subjects protections. If you have human subjects in your research, then you need to make sure that you're not torturing them or doing things that are otherwise they wouldn't like, revealing things about them that they might not like revealed. And then you'll need things like biosketches, which are 4-page documents that summarize for each investigator in the grant who they are and what they've done and why they're important. And letters of support, oftentimes you'll need from collaborators saying, you know, what a wonderful project this is, and it's going to advance science, and if you fund it, we'll all be much healthier. And so again, you can go to these to the NIH site and find all the types of information that you need to submit a grant. Now, even if you're not going to submit a grant, it's probably a good idea to look at this just to get some idea when you start thinking about a research project. And some of you may be doing this in the near future. If you go on to certainly if you go on to work at a company, you might be doing things like this. Or if you go on to a PhD program, a lot of times you'll want to apply for a predoctoral funding so that you don't have to live on the streets. You can actually support yourself, right? So you want to know how to do this. And it's a good idea to know how to do it before the deadline's actually there. So the grant process, you're going to write the grant. Sounds easy, but it's not. You're going to submit it on a given date. So all these grants usually have deadlines. The grant will get sent to a study section. So the study section is a group of experts who have been impaneled. They usually meet 3 times a year, and they review grants of a certain type. So the study section that I'm currently on is a training grant study section. We review these K grants and these dissertation grants, basically from students and young researchers. The study section will review it. Now, usually if you submit your grant in June, it will get reviewed in October. In the meantime, the government agency is looking through it, triaging the grants to all the right study sections, making sure that they're all following the rules, they have the right page limits, they're posting them up online, and so forth. And then they give the study sections some time in advance to be able to review. The study section reviews it. You meet for a day or two. You score the grants. The scores go to the institute. The institute then ranks everything. And then they meet, their council meets to decide on what they want to fund. Now, they will often review grants based on the scientific merit. So if the study section has said that this is the best grant, they'll often fund that grant, but they don't have to because they have priorities. And let's say the 3 best grants are all on the same subject and they don't want to fund 3 things on the same subject, they might pass some of them over and go to lower grants. There's also funding priorities set by their what's the word I'm looking for? The government in funding that institute may have set certain priorities. So for example, the National Cancer Institute might have been told, we want you to spend 20% of your money on breast cancer research. So they're going to, therefore, if they only got 10% of their grants were breast cancer grants, more of those are going to be funded than other kinds of grants. The grant is then usually awarded about 9 months after you apply, and the pay lines are very low, meaning that it's very hard to get these things. So generally only about 10% or so of grants that are submitted actually get funded, and then you can apply again. You can reapply, and a lot of times you have to apply twice. And I know people who write a grant every month, and they might get 1. And so this is very, very frustrating because it takes a long time to write a grant, and if you think about all of the nights, the 2 o'clock in the morning nights that you're staying up writing this grant, and you have a 1 in 10 chance of it getting funded, it's not very comforting. So if you can find somebody who's really good at getting grants and is very successful, that's a good person to latch on to because you're going to have a much better chance. Okay, a little bit about the study sections. They're composed of, as I said, senior scientists usually and a scientific review administrator who's the representative for the institute who makes sure that everything is done according to the rules. There's usually a standing study section, which means it's the same people who meet every quarter, usually with 3 or 4 year terms. Sometimes there's a guest reviewer if there's a grant that has a special topic that they need some expertise on. They meet 3 times a year for 2 days. Usually the reviewers get the grants about a month before the meeting, and each grant is assigned to 3 reviewers. one of whom is the primary, two are the secondary, and then each of those three people writes a discussion of the grant, and nowadays the grants are very, the grant discussions are very tightly organized, so there's certain sections you have to respond to. They give you very specific prompts, like under the investigator section, is the investigator qualified for the work? Is the mentor of the investigator qualified for the work? Do they have the right supplies? Do they have the right environment? Do they have the right training? All these kinds of things. You answer these questions. If you're a statistician, you sometimes get to read some extra ones because if there's some very specific topics that are very technical, they might want you to look at them. And you review these for significance, merit, and budget. So 50% of these are triaged out before the meeting, usually the lowest 50%. We give preliminary scores, and those that don't score a certain level, we don't even discuss. The remaining 50% are scored of 1 to 9, 1 being the best. Basically, the way it works is you come into the room, the 3 reviewers will read their reviews. You then will have a short discussion. You then take the initial scores that they gave before they gave a review. They then have a chance to change to the final scores, and then everybody scores. So let's say you scored, the 3 reviewers scored it, one is a 2, one is a 3, and one is a 4, so they're all pretty good. The other people in the room also get to score. You have a score sheet, and you can score anywhere between 2 and 4. You can score outside that range if you want, but if you want to do that, you have to send a special note to the review chair, basically saying why you're scoring outside of the calibrated. And then they take those scores, they look at all the scores over the course of a year for that study section, and then they assign a percentile ranking. So, you might have done really well in that particular session, but there might have been better grants the previous session, and so you don't have quite as high a percentile score. Okay, let me say one more thing. Think about when these grants are being reviewed. All right? These are people who have full-time jobs. This is basically volunteer work. I mean, we get paid like $100 or $200 or something, but it's not worth the effort of, I mean, if we were doing it for the money, that would not be it. Each one of these probably takes 3 or 4 hours to review. So if I review 4, I'm spending 16 hours reviewing these grants, plus the 2 days I'm spending going to Washington discussing these. So I'm spending probably 4 days on this, right? And all this because somebody I don't even know wants some money. So when am I doing this? I'm not doing this at 10 o'clock when I'm teaching. I'm not doing it at 2 o'clock when I'm meeting with students. I'm not doing it at 4 o'clock when I'm doing something else. I'm doing this at night or on the weekends or when I'm tired, when I really don't want to be doing this. So if you're writing a grant, make sure it's well written. You don't want your reviewer having to sit there for an hour figuring, what is this person talking about? Because usually what will happen is they'll just say, it's not worth my trouble, and just throw it away. Even though it's a fabulous idea, but if you have not written it well and you've not explained it clearly, or if you're missing important things on it, like you forgot to include the biosketch of your primary mentor, or just make sure that the grant is done well. That's the key thing. And the writing makes up a huge difference. I've had very good success with grants, partly because I sort of obsess on the writing, but I make sure that the thing makes sense. And show it to your colleagues. Make sure that it makes sense to your colleagues. Have them read it and say, would you fund this? There's a lot of smart people around places that you'll work and who actually know how to do this kind of thing. And it's really, really important that you don't just say, and when you're writing it, you're doing it in your spare time too, right? So you're writing it on your weekends. So don't just give it, say, I've only got an hour to do it. I'm just going to write something down quickly. What's the point of spending time on something that has little chance of getting funded if you're not going to actually get funded because you're not putting your best effort into it, right? So that's what I'd think. Think about who's reviewing it, when they're reviewing it. One of my old mentors used to say, write your grant so that if a pediatrician was reading it, he would want to fund your research over something which would save children's lives. In other words, it has to be such a compelling message that even somebody who's in another field will say, you know what? Even though I really want money in my field, this is really, really important and we really need to do this. Okay, because it's always a game. It's always a game as to what gets funded. Okay. All right, so we've got a few minutes if anyone's got any questions. I'll say more about the grant process and writing. Can't remember what the next topic is, but we'll talk a little bit more about the grant process and all the different sections of it and how you put them together. But this was just kind of an overview to give you a sense of how research goes in general. Okay. All right. Well, if no questions, we'll end there.
I do have one.
You do have one. Good.
So on one slide, I saw there's a terminology called wet or dry lab.
Wet or dry lab.
I don't know.
Okay. You know, for those, maybe somebody who's actually worked in a lab could explain this better than I can. You know, so in certain labs where you're dealing with animals or you're dealing with viruses or whatever, you know, a wet lab means you're actually dealing with materials that are sort of biological, and you might be manipulating specimens and that kind of thing. Whereas a dry lab is more like you're not dealing with you might be doing computations or something like that. So you have like arrays of genes and you're doing computations with them, but you're not actually manipulating materials. At least that's my understanding of these things. But if somebody else has worked in those environments and has a better explanation. So basically there's all kinds of labs, right? I mean, the labs we work in tend to be computational. But people who do chemistry or physics or biology will tend to, you know, be dealing with actual specimens of things.
I have a question. Like, do all PhD students apply for grants, or what's the percentage?
Yeah. So we actually at Brown require our PhD students to apply for a grant. They don't necessarily, you know, if they don't get it, it's not that they're kicked out or anything. But the idea is it's easier for everybody if there's more grants around. And it's also a good experience to learn to write a grant. So some of the you could ask around, but some of the PhD students, I think, for example, Mike Lopez had a grant. I don't know which of the current students have grants, but that's usually done in, say, maybe the third year, because you really have to have a pretty good idea. So you can't do it before you've kind of started to work in the area. And so the funny thing about dissertation grants is they oftentimes, the person almost has to be finished the research by the time they get the grant. But that's true of a lot of grants, where you will oftentimes be applying for funding to do things you, in a sense, have already done, because you can't get the funding otherwise. So you're basically getting, it's almost like you're getting money for something you've done in the past, but then you want to carry it on, right? So if you think about somebody who's got a whole research agenda that's going to go over a span of years, they're going to continue to get funding. They could apply for, they could write their grant for funds for things that they would like to do in the future, but if they really have no idea how that's going to work, it looks like a very speculative idea, and so it's not going to be funded as easily as something where people are pretty sure it works. And for people to be pretty sure it works, it usually means they've already kind of done it to some extent. I mean, they've done preliminary work.
Yeah, I'm just curious about is that contracted research, right? That's kind of like a consulting? Or
Yeah, it's like consulting.
it's a company?
So yeah, a contract research organization is a company that basically does work for other companies. So if a company needs, for example, somebody to do a data analysis, or they need somebody to set up a study for them and monitor it, or they need somebody to do a long-term follow-up of safety events, they might hire another company which is good at collecting data like that and putting together, you know, internet systems and that kind of thing to do it for them.
Like,
Yeah.
some example?
Well, so Quintiles is one, is a big company that is a contract research organization. They have offices all over the country. And so if you work for them, they will put you on a certain project, and then you might get switched to another project after that one ends. And so you're basically, yeah, you are basically a consultant in those cases, because you're working on different projects that the company is getting. It's almost like if you worked for a construction company, right? The company is getting funds to build houses or build buildings, And so you're going to get sent to whatever building you're working on. And then once that building's finished, you'll get sent to another building. And maybe you are a plumbing company, and so you're being subcontracted by the contractor to do the plumbing on that building, right? So that's kind of the idea. Okay? All right, thanks.